Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to show you how I shoot and edit my Milky Way photos. This video is meant for beginners, and by beginners, I mean if you already have a slight grasp on how to properly expose a photograph using the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed, then this video is for you. If you're a complete beginner and just getting used to handling your camera, I'll go ahead and leave a link down below on a video that I think will get you up to speed so that you can join us back for this video. Astrophotography actually holds a bit of a special place in my heart. It's actually what got me back into photography about 5 years ago after taking a break from the hobby for about 5 years. I was living in Las Vegas at the time, and someone was supposed to actually visit me on a holiday weekend. They ended up canceling their trip, and instead of playing tour guide, I had to find out something else to do to occupy my time during that holiday weekend. So I decided to take up photography again. I had already been browsing IG at that point and was inspired by the photos I saw there and decided I wanted to try it myself. Within a week, I picked up a Nikon D750, a 24-70 f2.8 lens, quickly watched a few videos on shooting the Milky Way, and quickly headed out to Death Valley National Park, which is about a 2-hour drive from where I live in Las Vegas, so not a short drive by any means there. Unfortunately, my first time out wasn't the smoothest of first outings. I guess I was too excited and didn't really pay attention to those videos I was trying to learn from. This is how it looked when I arrived. You can see there is no Milky Way, and we'll talk about how to find the Milky Way and plan for it in a little while. Even though it wasn't the smoothest of outings my first night, I did eventually capture a few shots of the galaxy that night, and thankfully it wasn't a complete waste of a 2-hour drive. Here I'm going to roll some photos on some samples of my Milky Way photography and how it's progressed over the 5 years that I have been practicing it. I don't shoot it much these days, mainly because of the time it takes to travel to a dark location, but I do still enjoy getting out under the stars every once in a while. Hopefully this video contains all you need to make your first time shooting the Milky Way a little bit more successful than it was when I first shot my Milky Way. So let's get started with everybody's favorite: what gear do you need to bring when you're out in the field? As I mentioned, I picked up a D750 when I first started back in 2015 and a 24-70 f2.8. Even though the D750 could probably be found at a much lower cost these days, you definitely don't need to go that high end to start out. You really just need a DSLR or mirrorless system within the past 6 to 8 years or so that you can pair with a fast lens like 2.8 or faster. And many of you watching this right now probably have that already, or something close to it. I don't shoot with the D750 anymore these days. Right now I'm using a Fujifilm XT4, but basically you can pair any camera from the past even 8 to 10 years with a fast lens and still get nice results without spending too much money. I'll leave a link below to some lower cost systems you might want to start with instead of going high end to begin with, especially if you're not sure if you want to stick with the hobby. Very generally, the newer the camera that you get, the better the results you get as far as having a clean file. But some cameras are a little bit better than others, like the D750 or some of the newer Sony full frame cameras, but you definitely don't have to spend a whole ton of money to get started. As far as focal length goes, wider is better to start as you can get longer exposures without star trailing. I suggest something below a 24mm full frame equivalent if you're wanting to stick to just basic single exposure for your shots. Here's an example of stars trailing, which is definitely not what you want for the typical Milky Way nightscape shot. As a general rule, to avoid star trailing and blurry stars, divide 500 by the full frame equivalent focal length, and that will give you the longest exposure time you can use to still have sharp stars that are round. As an example, I have the Samyang 12mm f2 for my Fuji film system, and with the Samyang 12mm that gives me about a 18mm full frame equivalent. So what I'll do to find the longest exposure I can get without star trailing, I'll take 500 and divide that by 18, which gives me about 27 seconds without star trailing. Now that's just a general guideline, it's not set in stone. You can experiment and see what works best for you, but I find that using that rule is a very good place to start. So you have your camera, you have your lens, and now you want to bring out a sturdy tripod with you. You're going to be doing long exposures, so you want to minimize any shake that you can, so make sure you bring a very sturdy tripod. You can also bring out a camera shutter release, but I find that my 2-second timer works well enough. Sometimes I like to bring the shutter release, but if I forget it or don't feel like taking it out, I'll just use my 2-second timer on the XT4. And also you might want to bring a headlamp when you go out in the field. That's going to help you get around. Also, it's going to help you to find out your settings if you really need to look at your camera. Ideally, you want to learn your camera well enough to operate it in the dark, but if you do need your headlamp, bring it just in case. When you're out in the field, also make sure to practice proper etiquette. Sometimes you're not the only photographer out in the field, and make sure you have your headlamp off if you feel like, or if you see that someone is taking photographs of the night sky along with you. So step 2 involves planning. First thing you want to do is make sure you know when the Milky Way season is in your area that you're shooting. And by Milky Way season, I mean the core of the Milky Way, which is what people typically think about when you mention the Milky Way. A quick search on Google should be sufficient to let you know when to go out. If it's before or past the season, you can still shoot the Milky Way, you just might not get much or any of the core. Next, make sure the sky is dark enough. A light pollution map like the one at darksightfinder.com should be sufficient enough to tell you if you are far enough away from city lights. Next, find the Milky Way. This is easy enough if you just Google which direction the Milky Way is visible from your location. If the area you're shooting from is dark enough, you should be able to see it easily with your naked eye. You can also use an app like Starwalk or PhotoPills to find out the orientation of the Milky Way and its position at a certain time in the night. So the next step is to make sure to find out if the moon is out. Now, if the moon is out, it's really not going to be ideal. And this is actually what happened to me the first time I went out, which I really messed up. I was just too excited. I went out and forgot to check if the moon was out. When I got there, the moon was out and it was just too bright and it washed out the Milky Way. So please keep that in mind. I had to wait until 2 a.m. until the moon went down, and by that time the core was already below the horizon. Make sure the moon is not out or at minimal phase before you travel 2 hours like I did. PhotoPills can help you to determine the moon phase as well as the rise and set time of the moon so you can determine the best time to go out. If it's your first time out, you'll probably be happy enough to just properly capture the Milky Way with your camera, but later down the road you might want to compose your shot so the Milky Way aligns with some landmark, and PhotoPills is great for that too. You can pick a landmark on the app and find out when the Milky Way aligns with that landmark, and you can preview its position or angle to help visualize how it might work with your chosen landmark. Also very important, make sure it is a clear night when you go out. Clouds will obscure the view of the Milky Way, so make sure it is clear when you go out. One app I like to use is Clear Outside, and it tells me the total cloud cover at certain times of the night. Now let's talk about the settings on the camera. Settings do vary from camera to camera, but I've shot the Milky Way now with 3 or 4 different systems. I've used the Nikon D750, the Pentax K1, the Fuji XT2, the XT3, and the XT4, and the general settings that I'll share with you have satisfied my expectations regarding noise and clear files. Now, I am a bit of a creature of habit and have hardly changed from these settings, but you can definitely experiment on your particular system to see which settings work best for you. File type, make sure to use RAW, not JPEG. This is very important so you can have the most information in your files to be able to edit them the way you want. Focal length of the lens, 24mm or less to start. Again, the wider the lens, the longer exposures you can get away with, and the more light and information you can gather in each file. Aperture should be f2.8 or faster if available. For example, f2 or f1.4 being faster than f2.8. Shutter speed, 20 seconds to 25 seconds should work well enough. Remember the rule of 500, which is 500 divided by the full frame equivalent focal length, to give you an idea of the max exposure you can use without star trailing. For ISO, 3200 has been a very good base ISO that has worked for me. Slightly above or below is fine if you want to experiment, and again, this does vary from camera to camera to get the best results. White balance, I'll normally set to auto white balance, which is actually easy to adjust in post, and I'll show you how to do that when we start editing a photograph, for example. I'll make sure to flash these settings at the end so you can have a little bit more time to copy them down. So you're at the location and you know where to point your camera, you have your tripod set up, and you're ready to take the shot. So let's go over how to take the shot and go from there. Make sure to turn off all image stabilization if this is a feature on your camera. either in-body or lens stabilization, as this may lead to blurry shots. Compose your shot, frame it so you have the Milky Way and any foreground you want to include. Now focus your shot. Ensure the camera is in manual focus mode. Using the rear screen view of your camera, zoom in as far as you can into the sky, pick out one single star as your focus area, rack the focus back and forth, and set the focus as sharp as you can. I like to go back and forth a few times into and out of focus to bracket, as that helps me gauge precisely when the star is in focus. For the Fuji system, you need to turn off the exposure white balance preview to boost your view on the rear LCD screen. It's been a while since I've shot with a DSLR, but I don't believe you have to do this with live view on the Nikon or Pentax systems I've used. Now that the focus is set, enable your 2-second timer or your 10-second timer to be extra safe. Now release the shutter and wait for the magic to appear on your screen. So now you have your shot and we're ready to edit the photos. So let's go into the editing system and show you how I edit my photos. Today I'm going to be using Capture One. The controls in Capture One and Lightroom are fairly similar. They're not exact, but the basis and the general controls that I'll be doing for the global adjustments will work well. And of course, when we bring it to Photoshop, everything will be the same there. So again, today we're going to be using Capture One and Photoshop for our edits here on the Milky Way. You can use Lightroom if you want, but today I'm using Capture One because that's just my preferred editor for Fujifilm files. And since I started using it for Fujifilm files, I actually started to prefer it for my other files that are non-Fujifilm. So that's why we're using Capture One today. What I like to do when I'm editing my photos is I like to make sure that first I neutralize the photo in the raw editor. By neutralize, I mean I want to make it a somewhat flat image that gives me a little bit of room to operate when I bring the file into Photoshop. And then in Photoshop, I make my adjustments and dial in the photo the way I want to. So I dial in things like contrast as well as saturation to get it just the way that I like. So let's start here in Capture One. This photograph here is the photo that we're going to be working with. This was actually taken back in 2015. I think this was actually my third time out shooting the Milky Way, and this is off the coast of California. We can see there's a rock here as well as the Milky Way right in the center, and I've already cropped this, and really I just want to show you how I adjust the contrast and the brightness before we bring this into Photoshop. So the first thing I'm going to do is adjust the exposure. So we're just going to bump that up just a little bit here. And we've got that looking pretty good there. And then next here in the foreground, I want to bring that up a little bit. Again, we're probably going to adjust the contrast when we bring it back into Photoshop, but for now, I want to bring that up to flatten the image just a little bit there. So we'll bump up the shadows, and we'll also bump up the blacks here to get it to be a little bit more brighter on the bottom here. And the next thing I'll do, again, I do this in Lightroom as well, is I bump up the clarity to add just a little bit of contrast here in the Milky Way. And then I'll actually bump the regular contrast up just to get it a little bit more crisp to start out. So that's looking good as far as an exposure goes. This is really just a simple start here in our raw editor. And the next thing I'll do is adjust the white balance. So with the white balance, I learned this trick, I think from another YouTube video or someone in my photo group. I can't remember where I learned this from, but basically what I learned is in order to find the white balance, you just bump up the saturation all the way. So you can see we bumped it up all the way to 100%. And of course, we're not going to leave it like that, but bumping the saturation up is going to allow us to see where our photograph is cool and where our photograph is most warm. So we've got it up to 100%. And now what you're going to do is basically bracket the white balance until you have a nice balance of the cool and the warm tones in the image. So you can see when we increase the saturation, our image here is going to be very orange, and that means we're a little bit too warm. So what we'll do, again, we're going to cool it down in the direction of blue, and you can see now I've overdone that, and the image is now way too blue. And then we're going to take it all the way back to orange here, and you can see it's way too orange. So we're just going to keep going back and forth. Again, too blue there, a little bit too orange. Let's cool it down a little bit. And now we have something that's nice and balanced in the middle. So now that we have our white balance set, we're going to go ahead and decrease the saturation to where it was when we started. So you can see we have a nice flat, even picture, and this is actually pretty much ready to be sent into Photoshop. And I actually prepared another image that I'll send into Photoshop. So that's the image there that we're going to bring into Photoshop. And once you save that image into a TIFF file, bring it into Photoshop, and let's go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so we have that same flat image that we neutralized in Capture One or Lightroom if that was your case, and now we have it into Photoshop. I actually have the finished file here all opened up, and this file consists of 29 or 30 layers. I'm not going to go through all of the layers, but I'm just going to show you the most important layers on what I do to adjust these photographs for the Milky Way. And it really is simple. It's just going to be a couple of tweaks to the contrast, and then a couple of tweaks to the saturation. And then I'm going to teach you one trick that's just going to give us that little bit of a special look and more professional and polished look to our Milky Way image. So you can see here first on the first layer, we have our base layer that we neutralized in Capture One. And you can see on the second layer, I basically just adjusted the contrast by adjusting the curves. So I'll show you how to do that. I'll delete this layer and then we can just go ahead and redo it and then try to match it up again there. So let's go here. Let's open up an adjustment layer. So click on this box here on the bottom with the half circles here. Click that and then click curves, and our curves dialog box comes up. Now what you'll do is click this pointer arrow here, and what that does, when we click that, we can basically select any spot in our image to adjust to make brighter or darker. So here we'll click on the core of the Milky Way, and you can see a spot opens up there. And what we do is when we click that spot, what you want to do is drag the cursor up or down to make it brighter or darker. You can see I'm over exaggerating there, but our core, we do want to make that a little bit brighter. So let's just go ahead and raise that up. And then to add contrast, we're going to want to click on the darker areas of the photograph. So click there, you can see another point comes up on the curve there. And now we just drag down. So you can see starting here, all you do is drag down. So we add that little bit of contrast to the Milky Way. Now let's say we don't want it to affect the bottom of the photograph. What we can do is create a mask in order to just affect the top portion of the photograph. So you can see here when we make our adjustment layer, there's already a mask there that's been created for us. And now what we'll do is add a gradient. So just hit G on your keyboard and the gradient tool pops up. And then you can see it's going to be white to black here on our gradient. So when you're creating masks, just remember that white reveals and black conceals. So anything that's white is going to be affected by the adjustment layer, and anything in black is going to be hidden. So we'll go ahead and drag that. Again, white's going to be first. So let's just make our gradient. And you can see if you click Option and click the mask, that's the only part of the image that's being affected there. So let's go back and click on that, and let's click the before and after. And you can see that little bit of contrast has been added. That's probably the main thing that I do is I adjust the curves throughout the photograph, and I just do it little by little, and I work that little bit of contrast in with each layer. And you can see that's why I have a lot of layers in my photographs, because I dial in the contrast and the color very slowly to dial in the photograph just the way that I want it. So let's move on to the next step, and I'm going to show you this early because this is probably the coolest part about the process that I do, and it's something called star reduction. So you can see here when I turn on and off this next layer here, the star reduction layer, I'll go ahead and rename it star reduction. Now what the star reduction layer does is it dims down the brightest stars in the image so that you can get the viewer to focus on the main part of the image, or one of the main features of the image, which is going to be your Milky Way core here in the center. So watch when I turn it on, you can see those brightest stars are now dim, and then we can start working on the contrast of the Milky Way after we do that. So what you'll do, let me go ahead and delete this star layer. What you want to do to start your star reduction is create a new layer that is stamped. So in order to create your new layer, you want to combine any layers that you've already worked on and create a stamp of that layer. So it's basically all those layers combined with all of your adjustments. So this one's a little bit of a tricky thing that you have to do with the keyboard. All at the same time, you want to hit Shift, Option, Command, and then at the end you want to click E, and that's going to stamp your layer there. So now that you've stamped your layer, this is the layer that we're going to use to do our star reduction. Step 1 for the star reduction, we're going to click select and go to color range. Now that we're in color range, we'll select the highlights, and then the fuzziness, we're going to move up and down until we have the brightest stars selected. So you can see the preview, it's a little bit laggy right now, but right now we have a good selection of the stars. Let's increase it just a little bit, and you can see our preview there. Make sure you keep your preview at grayscale. It's only selecting the brightest stars. And range, you can also dial that in and out. Watch our preview down here as we slide it all the way to the left. It selects everything which we don't want. We slide it all the way to the right, it selects pretty much nothing. So something in the middle where we start to see that our brightest stars are selected. And those are the stars that we're going to dim with this star reduction technique. So once you have a good range there, go ahead and click OK. And then you'll see the marching ants pop up. Now what we'll do with the marching ants is we'll modify our selection. So click select, modify, expand, 2 pixels, and click OK. And now we'll go back to select, modify, feather, and enter 1 pixel there. Click OK. And now we have our selection. To hide the selection so we can actually see what we're doing with the star reduction, click Command H, and that's Command H on a Mac. And now we'll select filter, other, minimum, and you can see the preview comes up here. Let's move that preview up to the stars, and then we can zoom back in. And you can see the radius of 0.8. Watch when we turn the preview off and we turn it back on. I'll zoom in just a little bit there so you can see. Here we turn it off. There's the preview, and we turn the preview back on. So you can see those stars have dimmed quite a bit there. And in order to find the value that's going to work for your photograph, what you can do is zoom into 100% and turn the radius all the way down to 0.2. And then you can work it back in until you start to see artifacts, and then you can dial it back down. So let's go ahead and just start to increase that. And it's still looking okay at 0.8. And let's go ahead and click it just a little bit more. You can see if we overdo it to 2.0, we get weird blotchiness in the photograph. So we have to dial it back down. And now we're at 1.0, and you can see it's not looking as weird at 0.9 or 0.8. I think 0.8 is a pretty good number to start with, so we'll go ahead and click OK. So that was probably the biggest trick that I can show you to make your Milky Way photos stand out just a little bit more and look a little bit more polished. So that's the star reduction. So watch when we turn it off and we turn it back on again. And then from here on out, it's basically just a little bit of adjustments of the contrast. Some people like to leave it like this. Some people like to push it a little bit further. I'm somewhere in between where I like to push it a little bit further than straight out of camera. So now you can see my next layer. I've applied some curves here. So again, it's just the same thing there. When I double click, you can see my slight S curve there. I can delete all these and just redo that again. So just as a recap, what you'll do is click on this little pointer button, and let's make this a little bit bigger. Now we can increase the core of the Milky Way to make it a little bit brighter, and then the surrounding areas we can make a little bit dimmer to make it pop just a little bit more. And then here on the somewhat mid-tones of the sky, we can darken that down to increase the contrast just a little bit more. So we'll click to close that. You can see the before and then the after there. Now let's say you felt like you went overboard. You can always change the opacity here to something that's a little bit lower. What I like to do sometimes is just start at 0, and then I click shift and up to adjust it in 10% increments until I get to a spot where I like. Usually a third of the original effect is something good to leave it at. Again, we're slowly working it in, so if we need to add a little bit more later, we can just do that by either increasing the opacity of our adjustment layer, or we can just create another adjustment layer down the road. And the next layer that I'm going to go over here is, it looks like when I click it on, it was a dodge and burn layer. Now, normally I use what we call luminosity masks. And if you're not familiar with that, I won't get into it in too much detail, but luminosity masks allow you to specifically adjust a photograph, dodging and burning it, or doing whatever type of adjustment you want. And with the mask, it basically just affects the part of the image that you want based on its brightness. Here I want to dodge just the highlights, so watch when I create my luminosity mask here in the Tony Kuiper panel. If you don't have the Tony Kuiper panel, I definitely highly recommend that. If you want, you can create your own luminosity masks, and I'll show you quickly how to do that. But the luminosity mask panels that are available out there, not just the Tony Kuiper one, but I think there's other photographers that have developed these panels, it makes your workflow a lot faster than having to make your own luminosity masks. So here again, we're going to go back to the dodge layer that I did here. When I turn it off and on, you can see these white areas of the ocean I've dodged to make a little bit brighter. So watch, we turn it off and turn it back on again. To make your luminosity mask, go to Select, Color Range, and that's the same color range that we used for the star reduction. We'll go ahead and select the highlights, and then we'll increase the fuzziness until we start to see here, again on that bottom grayscale image, anything that is light area, that's going to be the part of the image that will be affected by our dodging. So you can see the water is now white, and that's what we want. Now if we increase the range or decrease the range, that'll allow us to just dial it in a little bit better. So I want a little bit more of that ocean to be showing and that foamy part of the ocean to be showing. So we'll go ahead and slide it to the left there. And then we'll click OK. And you can see our selection has been made there. Now what you'll do is make another layer for your dodge layer. And then you'll click here to make a layer mask. And that'll convert the selection into a mask. So now that we have a new dodge layer, let's just go ahead and rename that dodge to make it a little bit brighter there. And then make sure to change your blend mode to overlay or soft light. So I like overlay, it gives you a little bit of a stronger effect. Now what we'll do is start painting in there. So let's go ahead and select just a white to brighten that area up. So now we click OK. And then make sure you're not painting on the mask, make sure you're painting on the actual layer. So we'll click B to select our brush tool. Let's increase that. And let's select an opacity of 25 to start, 26, and then the flow at 10%. And now when we start brushing onto our photograph here, we're gonna just brush kind of nonchalantly because we know that we're protecting everything else but these white areas, and we're only dodging into the areas that we want because we made our luminosity masks. So watch, and we just slowly work it in there. And that just adds a little bit more pop to these highlights that we've selected. Watch when we turn it off and turn it back on again. I'll exaggerate it just a little bit more here so you can see it on YouTube a little bit better through the compression. So let's just go ahead and make it overkill right now. Again, I normally wouldn't make it this bright, but let's just do that to be able to demonstrate what it's doing here. So I've dodged that area. Now we turn it off and turn it back on again. And maybe you notice that these areas that are dark are not getting brighter. It's only the bright areas that are getting brighter because of our luminosity mask. So that's the power of the luminosity masks. Again, if you haven't downloaded a panel yourself, I highly suggest that you do check it out because it really does increase your workflow and make things a little bit more smoother. So I really think it's looking good. Again, I'm not going to show you all of my layers because it is just basically tweaking the contrast little by little until I get to a point that I like. So again, a lot of people just like to leave it at this. If you want to push it a little bit more, you can start adding color to the Milky Way to make it seem a little bit warmer and more vibrant. Now, if you are doing a star tracker, that's something for a different video, but using a star tracker actually gathers information. So using the curves adjustment allows you to get a more colorful and dynamic Milky Way without having to dodge in false color. So let's go ahead and just show you how to dodge it in to add a little bit more warmth to the core. So again, we're gonna create a luminosity mask. This time I'm just gonna go ahead and use the panel to make it a little bit faster. Here, I've selected the highlights, and that's the part of the image that I want to make a little bit warmer. And I'll go ahead and select here and create a dodge layer. Now we'll sample the core of the Milky Way. So hold down Option and click on a part of the Milky Way there, and that'll give you a color that's in the middle of the core there. And it's given us some kind of pink. Normally it's going to be a little bit of an orange in most files, so I'll go ahead and shift it back to the orange, and I'll select something in between orange and red. Now let's turn our opacity down just a little bit here, and then we'll bump the flow up. Again, I'll probably overdo this so that you can get an idea through the screen here on YouTube. So in our dodge layer, let's go ahead and dodge that in there. And you can see it's adding a nice warmth to the Milky Way. Let's turn that off and turn it back on again. And that does look like it's a little bit too strong. So again, let's just go ahead and go back to the opacity, dial it all the way down to 0, and then just slowly increase it until you have something that you like. So let's go ahead and just slowly click up. And I think 30% looks pretty good. So again, off and back on again, and that effect is looking a little bit better with a little bit more subtlety there. Usually the last thing I like to do is add a little bit of vibrance to the image, and then after that I'll just add a little bit more contrast. So let's add the vibrance, and we'll make a new vibrance layer. And in the regular vibrance layer, you can see our options to adjust the vibrance and the saturation. Vibrance usually just turns up all the colors that are not super saturated, and then saturation acts more to increase the saturation of the entire image. So let's start with the vibrance and see how much we want to add. 30 looks pretty good there, and let's go ahead and make the entire image just a little bit more saturated, and that looks pretty good at 10. So we'll close that. Let's turn that off and turn that on. It's looking pretty much close to done there. A lot of times I'll change the color balance here on the rocks. It's looking a little bit green to my eyes. I won't go over that just because this is more of a beginner's tutorial, but know that you can adjust the color balance here in the rocks to make it a little bit more neutral and even. And again, the last thing I like to do is just add a little bit more contrast. Here, let's go ahead and just do a levels adjustment. So of course you can always change the opacity. So when you first start out, you can be a little bit more lax and nonchalant with it. And that's actually looking pretty good there. We'll bring the blacks up just a little bit to add some fade to it. And we'll close that. And again, we want to dial it down, dial it all the way to 0, increase it to about 30. And that looks pretty good there. So now I'm back in my original working file, so I can just show you the before and the after. Watch when we turn off all the adjustment layers. That's the neutralized image that we had from Capture One, or in some of your cases, Lightroom. And then we turn the adjustment layers back on, and we now have our finished image there. I think the biggest tip I can give you with editing is to work in your adjustments slowly and just add it layer by layer. These files do start to get a little bit large, so do keep that in mind, but it's worth it, even though the files are large, to be able to dial in the photograph exactly how you want. So go ahead and take your time, have fun with it, and try to get something that's personal to you. If you like to keep it muted, that's fine. If you like it really colorful, that's fine too. Photography is an art form, so it's really up to you, the photographer and the artist, to decide how colorful or how muted you want your photograph to be. Well, that's all we have today on shooting and editing the Milky Way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to click subscribe, ring the notification bell, hit the thumbs up button, as it really does help to support my channel. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.